Good evening, everyone. I just want to remind you that before we get started here, to have everyone mute their mics. That just keeps it easier for me, and I don't have as much delay and everything, so I can do that a little bit more easily. So I'll give everyone a couple seconds to do that here, and I can see who's all muted. Looks like we're all good. All right, Scout salute, pledge to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Scout sign, Scout oath. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. All right, thank you.
All right, and for all the Scouts, some of you guys are easier to figure out who is out there by the names that you have displayed. Some do not. So sometimes having your video on will help me understand who is out there so I can make sure that we get attendance properly and catch everybody. All right, Christian.
Yep, and that helps us keep the news here and paying attention. So, all right, good evening, everyone. Did everybody have a chance? I'm hoping everybody got to see that the video beforehand. Is there a decent amount of people that did? Try to be honest, because it just went over a general layout of food service and some issues. Did everybody get a chance to do that? I was hoping we did, because it's about 12 minutes long. That way we can cut that out of the meeting time. Is there anybody who wants to respond to anything they picked up from that video? Anybody who wants to turn their mute off and respond?
I watched the video.
Who is that?
Aston.
Didn't watch it.
Yeah.
Was there anybody else?
I watched it, Christian.
It just goes over. Well, for you guys, by just honesty standards, I'd like you guys to watch it after from next week. Just catch up on that, because we're supposed to actually tour a food service place. So that's usually probably about an hour thing. I'm only making you watch a 12-minute video, so it's really not that unreasonable, all things considered. So if you get a chance, just watch it. Basically, a few points on that. They talked about, a lot of it they talked about was some of the problems you run into a restaurant and a food service area as far as with critters. They talked about fly management, cockroaches. They talked about also mice and other things that can get in there. And I think one of the main reasons you got to be concerned about that in a food service area is, one is customers seeing it, but also the amount of bacteria and germs and diseases they can carry. So that's one thing. And as far as your school cafeteria and restaurants, that you really have to be on top of. Because if you get a cockroach or an ant infestation, it can shut you down with one of these, food service places. And they do have inspections. Typically, the state does a time thing, but sometimes if there's infractions, they might do an unplanned inspection. So if they start getting violations, they will start doing that. So as long as they keep up to date and certification, it's usually not a problem. Tim, we're going to be starting at number 44 then, I think, and then we'll work forward on that. Was there anybody else who had anything questions about some of the issues they talked about? So some of it we're going to go over in the presentation tonight too, with some of the slides that I want to get into a little bit. And the one thing that we deal with as far as food poisoning and other diseases that you can pick up with food that we try to maintain as far as our Scout situation and just at home in general, you can help your family out with. And if you ever do work in a food service, then you have a general idea how things should be handled and taken care of. So we'll jump in now to some of the things. They give a nice system there. It's called FATM. They talk about 6 factors that affect bacteria growth. It's food, acid, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. And we're going to go through each one of those Do I have control now, Tim?
You will here in a second.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Okay, that's great. Let's see if we work. All right, good. So we're going to go over one of these factors. So it's food. One of the things is bacteria require food to survive. That's their feeding source. A lot of times your protein-rich foods, your meats, things like that, chicken, that has a lot of bacteria growth. We're going to go over some of the other foods as well. Acid, bacteria do not grow in an acidic environment. So one of the things in the videos, they talked about containers cross activity. And that has a little date to it because a lot of the things we have today as far as metals, aluminums, and stuff like that. So that's why a lot of times Tupperware is actually not a bad product to store food in because it doesn't have any reaction with any kind of acidic things. There's things you can add to food, even fruit and vegetables that help with acidity. You know, they talk about lemon juice, vinegar, but also lime. Down in a lot of countries below the equator, around the equator, they use a lot of lime products. One, they grow very well, but it actually keeps food very stable in the heat because the acidic level and they like the flavor of it. But the reason they started using it is mostly because of the way it keeps food stable because of the acidity with limes. So that's one of the reasons they're used in a lot of those tropical areas. Temperature, most bacteria will grow between 4 degrees to 6 degrees Celsius, which is 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's an important thing. We're going to talk a lot about temperature. I think out of all of it, if food's bad, it's bad. You got to get rid of it. But a lot of times, temperature of cooking, cooling down, storage, all those kind of things, and particularly on our campouts, when I'm buying food, most of the time they're going to be fresh food. We don't have to really worry about the fact that we're getting old food or whatever. We're up to date with a lot of food things. Now we're in a different time period right now with meat, but most of the time, most places try to keep the stuff fresh. A lot of times it's going to be when after something's cooked is getting it stored or the preparation and the temperature. If you have it out too long before you actually cook it, preparation can be a lot of factors. So I think temperature is one of the biggest things. It was storage and also leftovers. Time, bacteria need time. And a lot of times when you freeze something, freezing it will actually stop the bacteria from growing. But if it's just in a refrigerator, it actually only slows it down a little bit. So when you heat it up, you still got to recook it. If it's high in bacteria, that can be a difference where food can spoil a lot quicker. So that's why the temperature that your fridge should be cold enough that it keeps the bacteria from actually expanding and growing. If it's not below a certain temperature, such as 40 degrees, usually a lot of refrigerators you're going to see around 34, 35 around that temperature. But if it's actually closer to that 40 degrees, then you do have to worry about bacteria being able to grow on it. So that's why we keep it at a cold temperature. Or when you're cooking it, it goes above a certain temperature as well. And the bacteria likes that time. So if you're not getting it cold enough or you leave it out overnight and don't put it away, then that bacteria will start growing. It has that time factor and also the temperature. So when you add the two together, time and temperature, that's when you're going to get the most accelerated growth. And then if you add the particular food product, that's where a lot of times food poisoning is going to occur. Oxygen, there is two types of bacteria, aerobic bacteria that requires oxygen, and then there's anaerobic, which doesn't require, oxygen. One of the types is the typical is Clostridium botulism, which you hear, that's something that can be pretty nasty with certain food products. And that does not require oxygen, so that can thrive in a low oxygen environment. And then it talks about moisture as the last thing. They like more of a moisture surface if it's dry and things are wiped down and left dry and you're using cleaning products. A lot of these restaurants now, especially now when they get back opening up with this virus, they're going to be using a lot of antiseptics and products. And then once you wipe them, you let them dry. Once it's sprayed and then dried is when the most of the antiseptic qualities kick in. So that's another thing. All right, so that's the FATM thing. Foods that have FATM condition are considered potential hazardous foods. And that's called PHFs. So there's PHFs and there's non-PHFs. We're going to go to different things which are considered perishable. And that's a difference. Some things on a camp out, when they're in cans and they're dry foods and things like that, I keep them in a plastic bin. I don't have to worry about keeping them cold or temperature prepared. All the other stuff that's considered that potential hazardous food, that has to be kept at a certain temperature. So we're going to camp out, and if it's cold out, we're around 20 degrees, I don't have to worry about it. I just put it in the cooler with a minimal amount of ice. But if it gets to where that temperature starts getting above 40 degrees, I got to make sure that I have enough cooler products and also keeping the food separate so they're not contaminating. So generally a food is called a PHF, is any kind of animal product. So you look at your meat, your milk, your eggs, your fish, shellfish, and poultry. So when you think of animal, these are all substances, unless they're treated a certain way or salted or dried out or dehydrated, which is a different story. We'll get into that. These products are perishable and they will become hazardous food if you're not following the temperature and storage. Anything plant origin, vegetable, beans, fruit, etc., have been heat treated or cooked. And that's an important part. You can have beans in a bag that's dehydrated and dry, and they can sit in there probably for years. Once you add the moisture, add the cooking component, then they also have to be eaten or they will degrade and they can get you sick. Beans have proteins in, just like anything else. They're not as bad as what your animal products are, but they still, once they're cooked, they now have to be stored and cooked properly, just like other products if they have leftovers. Vegetables are the same thing. You cook them. Now, vegetables that are just sitting in the fridge, they're just going to rot and they're going to taste bad. But once you cook them, that's actually where they can grow bacteria as well. And also when they're prepared, a lot of things with vegetables, if they're contaminated, such as a sick worker, and on the video, that was one of the examples they gave on that, is the worker had some kind of sickness or he has a skin condition. Let's say if he's a bad cut and it's infected, that's a lot of times you can go. I think the biggest thing in a restaurant is someone goes to the bathroom and they don't wash their hands and they start preparing food. It's a disgusting thought, but that's exactly how you can have a meat plant, a vegetable plant, have a complete recall on food because there's been contamination, and that contamination can grow in one of the processing points where all that food that was made that particular day or two is now contaminated and they have to recall. Your raw sprouts, beans, alfalfa, and anything cooked starch. Rice and pasta is stable. It's dry. Once you add water and cook it, it's then can break down if you don't store it properly, and also can get you sick with it. Again, not as bad as some of the animal products if you don't mix it with other food. And then, of course, your soy protein, soy and milk. So we have some examples here of the PHFs, which are perishable, and the non-PHF. For example, when you look on the left side in the purple, you look at chicken, beef, pork, and other meats. But then you look at beef jerky. What's done with beef jerky? It's dehydrated, and a lot of times we'll add some kind of either seasoning or salt mixture that will keep that from allowing bacteria to grow on it. Bacteria doesn't like salt and it doesn't like some of the seasonings. So that's why a lot of people that do their own dehydration, that's going to be a safe product as long as you're adding enough and you're thoroughly dehydrating it. If it's only partially dehydrated, it can also break down and make you sick. You got to keep that in mind that you have to dehydrate it long enough. You look at your pastries filled with meat, cheese, a meat pie, a cheese pie, those are all things. Cooked rice as opposed to non-PF, uncooked rice. Again, these are things you could store. You look at fried onions versus raw onions. Raw onions, they will break down, but once you cook them, there's going to be like any other product. You do have to actually refrigerate them, and then you have to heat them to a certain temperature again so they don't make you sick. If they're left out too long and put in the fridge, that is sometimes a case in restaurants where raw onions can get you just as sick with certain kinds of food poisoning. Not as severe as sometimes as your meat and beef, but it still can get you food poisoning if it's left out too long and not thoroughly cooked when it's reheated. Open cans of meat, anytime you open it, if it's in a can and it's left properly stored without puncture sites or rusted through, then it's going to be safe and you can use it. There is expiration dates on some of them, but a lot of those canned goods will stay good a long time. Tofu is another thing that breaks down. That's something that has to be stored within temperature ranges. Then you get your uncooked beans. I had said about that before, in canned or in bags that are dehydrated. That is a long shelf life. Coffee creamer. Now, there are some non-dairy that could probably, when we have cookouts, if they're non-dairy, I sometimes will leave them out for a little bit in the morning as the adults are getting their coffee, and then I usually try to put it in after a little bit, but it's not going to spoil as quick as some of your cream products if it's non-dairy. Cooking oil is good. Then we let that in the trailer. Sometimes it's just when it freezes over the winter, then we have to get it to thaw. But otherwise, that's pretty well stable. Unless it gets contaminated, where you mix a lot of times, like with bacon, if you decide to return the bacon grease and try to filter it out, if the bacon's in it, you can't really store it like a safe type olive oil that's in a container that isn't contaminated. So you got to keep that in mind. Fresh garlic and oil as opposed to fresh garlic. that isn't harmed. Again, these vegetables will eventually break down, but once they're cooked, they have to be treated like other foods. And then you look to fresh or cooked eggs. Powdered eggs, I have some of those in the basement that you can just add water to. And again, when they're in the sealed container and there's no water that touch them, they have a very long shelf life. And you look at gravy that's cooked, flour that's dry, and then soup mix with water added. If it's dry and dehydrated, that also has a long shelf life, as long as the container isn't damaged. If you go and you look at a soup container and again, there's a rip in it, then you probably have to get rid of it in case some moisture got in there or some critters. So something to keep in mind. So the main thing with the danger zone, we look in here, and I like this graph on presentation because it kind of gives you a real idea. That danger zone we talked about is between 40 to 140 degrees. And what that means is if you're under that temperature of 140 degrees and it's not cooked enough, then that can be something. If it has a certain amount of bacteria, you're not cooking it thoroughly through, and some meats are like that. Also, as you're cooling it, it's very important that you get it cooled in that range for a certain amount of time. We're going to talk about time periods that it can sit out before it cools, and then after that, you have to get it back in the refrigerator, get it cold again as that's thawing down. There is a process. You do want to get something that's hot, cool it down within a certain amount of time, and then get it refrigerated thereafter. And that's important because, again, once that bacteria starts growing, the time factor becomes an issue where that can grow. But as long as you let it cool, get it back into a cold environment, the bacteria will kind of hold off from growing. When you look at the zones, bacteria die above 165 degrees. That's why when they talk about meat, I still do like my meat medium rare at restaurants. And as long as I know the restaurant's a good restaurant and they move their food very well, I'm comfortable with that. However, if it's at a restaurant I don't know very well, I sometimes will consider getting it medium done so I know it's cooked through. And then you go down below 40 degrees. This is where most bacteria will survive, but they will not multiply quickly. So the bacteria is on the food, but it's kind of in a status quo. It's not thriving. It's not growing or replicating. But once you set it out on a cupboard, you want to cook that within a certain amount of time because then the bacteria will start replicating and growing. And then under 32 degrees is when we get to that lower temperature in the refrigerator. That's where most bacteria will not survive or not grow. It's around 0 degrees Celsius. And anything frozen, of course, that's pretty well neutralizing it. But again, if you stick something in a freezer and you freeze it and then you warm it up, the bacteria is still kind of there, certain types, so you still have to cook it. And that's why it's important. Some of the factors you guys might think about is your raw tuna, tuna that's barely just cooked and still raw in the middle. You look at oysters, you look at some of those things. And again, it's all based on the restaurants handling, how they handle those cold foods. And restaurants that deal with those kind of things usually have special training so they know exactly how to handle those products. I've never had trouble eating raw oysters or sushi or anything else like that, as long as you know the restaurant's very fresh. However, I have been some restaurants in Philadelphia at times where my belly was a little upset because I wasn't sure if they were really cooking it enough. So it is something you have to be understanding the place you eat at, that they're really handling, going by these temperature ranges. So we look at the improper handling of food, the 10 causes of foodborne illnesses. And when I first looked at this, I was kind of surprised, but when I double checked the numbers, it's true. When you look at the most common cause, goes in the top 10, number 1 to number 10, which is the least more common. And if you look at it, number 10 is actually inadequate cooking. So believe it or not, that's the lowest risk of getting sick. So a lot of times when people want to overcook their food all the time, then actually there's so many other steps before that. If you don't handle the food properly, how it was handled before it got to you, there's a lot of other causes that'll make you sick. Cooking is actually the lowest one there. And that's still, if you do undercook meat that has bacteria, obviously you're going to get sick, but there's a lot of other things. So you look at the first one is improper cooling, which was a surprise to me. So that means that after you cook it, it sits out, it's not cooled right. If it sits out too long where the bacteria grows, or you're kind of going too quickly either on the cooling process or too long, those are things that can affect the way food either turns bad or grows bacteria. Also, advanced preparation. A lot of these restaurants, if you're looking at them behind the scenes, the really good restaurants have a very good protocol. They usually have somebody getting stuff out, and they have these large refrigerator storage units in between the cooking stations. So you have one person getting out, like when you're mashing a fresh salad, they cut up the tomatoes, put them back in the fridge, and they'll bring out a certain portion. They'll scoop out a certain amount. So you have somebody getting the stuff out, then putting it back in the refrigerator. So it's never really sitting out. So when you go to a lot of these restaurants, this stuff isn't just sitting out. A lot of the better restaurants are usually going in and out, keeping it cold, needing it when they need it, and then they get the food out when it's ready to cook. They get it out at that temperature and then cook it. So if that food that you're not using sits out, and then you go cook it for somebody and it's been sitting out a few hours, especially if it goes from lunch to dinner, that's a problem. That's why some restaurants even like it that they only have meals prepared during a certain amount of time. They have a little bit of break to re-prepare, and then every thing just goes back in the fridge, and then they bring that food out when they need it for the dinner time if they have a similar menu. So there is a protocol that the better restaurants do, and I worked in some food service, and so the better cooks are very, very good at that, and having an assistant that gets that food prepared, washing their hands before they prepare anything, then putting it in containers that are sealed into the refrigerator, and they're not mixed with, between fruits and vegetables, they're not mixed with the meats. They usually have different refrigerator units for those products. Number 3 is affected person. That makes the most sense. If you ever wanted to look at something disgusting, have someone who has gloves on that are handling food and they keep going like this with their gloves, wiping their runny nose. That's somebody that literally needs to get fired. That's really bad protocol. So hopefully people that are in a food service industry, that's not something they'll do in particular. Most bosses, if you're sick, you got to call off and they got to let you know. They usually understand that they can't have somebody there running, or they put them at a different position that night that's not handling fresh food in the back that isn't going to be around customers. Improper hot holding. When you have holders out, let's say if you have an open bar that keeps putting food out, your steak houses, some of your other like Chinese restaurants, sushi places, they have heaters, they have coolers, and sometimes if the food isn't cooked and then put into the holder and it's just warmed up slightly, those warmers don't usually cook the food. They're only keeping it at a warm temperature. And so otherwise the food gets overcooked and gets dried or loses its flavor. So they have to be cooked before they get brought out. So a lot of times when you look at these steakhouses, they're bringing it out, the food's actually steaming. You can see how warm it is. So the only thing I would say is, as a customer, is you want to make sure that you understand that it's hot, so you don't go and start sticking it in your mouth before it cools down a little bit. But that's the other thing. Unsafe source, number 7, use of leftovers. And that's something we all do as family. We eat leftovers here, and we've never really had problems with it. But there is, again, certain requirements when to get it in the fridge after it cools down, keep it at a refrigerator at a certain temperature. A lot of things will say 3 days of leftovers. If you don't eat them, you should expose them. Me and my family, as long as they're properly handled and then they're cooked warm again, we have gone longer than that. I'm not saying everybody should, but the standard is 3 days. So I'm not going to tell you to go longer than that. But if you guys know how you're handling your food, that it's fresh in a certain way, you probably can go longer, but you have to inspect the food, smell it, and make sure it doesn't have any growth on there. But again, 3 days is the magic number that they say most leftovers should be eating. In the food service industry, they go at most a day or 2 if they're not freezing them. They don't go longer than that most of the time, and they're hoping they turn around. Cross-contamination, number 9, that's where meat will leak into, say, your vegetables. Let's say you have raw meat, and beet juice leaks over into the broccoli. And so that can be a problem because sometimes broccoli will just be charred a certain way, and if there's meat juice on it, it's probably not getting the cookout. Again, if that's been sitting out there, that's a good way to start food poisoning at your restaurant. All right. And then number 10, as we said, inadequate cooking. All right. So those are the top 10 things that can happen. And again, I was still surprised that improper cooling was the number 1, where inadequate cooking was number 10. It's kind of surprised me, but I guess if you think about it, that's one of the ways a lot of times it goes. So we'll go through each thing real quick. Improper cooling, again, people think that once food has been properly cooked, all disease-causing organisms are killed, which is really not true. Now, if you cook meat to where it's like a hockey puck, then still, if you leave it out and don't refrigerate it, it is true. But the more you cook it, the more bacteria it kills. But that process afterwards, if you have leftovers, you still have to follow the proper thing of letting it cool at a certain time period within 1 to 2 hours, getting it into a refrigerator unit so that bacteria will not grow after that. So some pathogens are heat resistant, certain spores are. There are some things that can be. So again, that anaerobic, that extreme botulism, that's something. If you're undercooking meat that's infected, you're still going to get sick with it. So that's something to consider in mind. When food begins cooling down, it enters the danger zone. That's where the spores will begin to grow and other bacteria. So if you leave it in that danger zone too long, that's where the bacteria is going to grow. And if it's in there too long, that's where a lot of times people will get sick, especially if you don't cook it, heat it enough the next time you use it. All right. So we talk about the temperature thing here. Food cooling procedure. This is important to remember. I like this graph. I found this. So after 140 degrees, after you're done cooking it, it's sitting out. A lot of times you serve the food with your family. It's sitting in the pan or the stove or whatever. It's sitting upside. Of course, that's going to start cooling down. And that's what you want it to. Once everybody's done with their food, you kind of have to cool down. You can't stick a hot pan in the refrigerator, and because that's not good. Obviously, it'll cause damage to the refrigerator, but that's actually not the proper technique you should use. So you should leave it chill for about 2 hours. I think sometimes food will cool enough at 1 hour, but between 1 to 2 hours, where it wants to go down to around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, then you can chill it 4 hours from 20 to 40 degrees. So at that point, then you can extend it down. You put it into the refrigerator. It'll drop into that temperature under 40 degrees where it's safe. So again, the 2 and 4 rule is what they recommend. Two hours to calm down from a hot temperature to that range, where at that point you then do want to get into a refrigerator. So if you cook a certain food and you leave it out overnight, that food's probably, that's something that you should dispose of that. It's not safe to eat anymore. Again, there are some foods you could probably get away with, but one of my jobs to tell you is that's not safe to use that food at that point. So the 2 and 4 hour rule is what they recommend. So it talks about the advanced preparation. That's where you're prepping for the meal. Again, when we do our scout meals, we have one is prep, cooking, and then cleanup. So prep is something. And when you talk about advanced preparation, when you're literally preparing the food 30 minutes before you cook, that isn't going to be the problem. What I'm talking about is when you're preparing, let's say you marinate a steak, you put some seasoning on it. Then what I would typically do is I put oil or a seasoning. You're going to put that in the refrigerator and let it sit, and then you want to bring the steak out about 20 to 30 minutes before you put it on the grill, so it gets to a little bit of that temperature, so it's not going from cold to hot on the grill. There are some oils and again some seasonings that can maintain it. There's certain like countries like Italy that has a process that can actually do this marinade of meat. And it's almost like a process, would almost be like a dehydration. But the meat stays fresh, but it's all the ingredients they add to it. They don't just get a raw steak and stick it in a room somewhere. That's not how they do it. It's what they add to the steak that allows it to basically curate it so it's protected during bacterial growth. And they have a whole process, either a low smoke or it's just the seasonings and oils they add. Again, olive oil is a pretty good stabilizing unit. You can get away, but again, how long you have it in that danger zone is a question that you got to make sure you know what you're doing. So food is left out of room temperature too long. The food is not heated related to the properly to a high enough temperature or not cooled properly. So as we're preparing the food, and then you have to either prepare it, cut it up if it's fruits and vegetables, put it back in the refrigerator before it's ready. And a lot of these restaurants, they're preparing between lunch and dinner. They're going to put it in the refrigerator until they're ready to bring it out for each meal, and then they're putting it back and forth into the fridge if they're going to use it, unless they know there's a lot of meals going at the same time and they simultaneously cook. If the food is brought in and out of the danger zone too many times, and then they're cooked, hot held or cooled and reheated, and again repeated a few times, that's a problem. So a lot of these buffets, that can be a problem. If they put out a buffet and say Saturday hours are real bad, there's not a lot of the food cooked, eat it from it. They'll bring it from the heaters and then cool it down and stick it. If you keep doing that for 2 days, that food really has a high risk that if it's not being cooled or cooked properly, likely it's going to start growing a certain bacteria and people are going to get sick. They might not get full food poisoning, but they might get an upset stomach or diarrhea. So that's why you got to hope that you're going to a place. It's one of those things, if the food doesn't get eaten, they got to throw it away. That's wasteful, but it is a safe way of doing it, because there's heat warmers or hot helders that hold the food. Again, they don't cook the food. They just keep it warm at a certain temperature. So to prevent problems, try to prepare all foods the same day to use and close to serving the meal as possible. And that's what we always do in Scouts. Every now and then I might do something, hey, let's prepare and do a little of this so we can just dump it out. But again, that should be put back in a refrigerator unit or cooler with ice until we're ready to use it. To prevent outside contamination, prepare in advance and cover them tightly. So again, if you have Tupperware or a sealed area, a lot of people use in a restaurant they usually use metal with lids, or they use glass with lids. And that is better. Plastic is a little more porous syntactically, but for our homes, as long as we're not storing it for a long amount of time, it's fine as long as you're following the protocol on how to cool and heat it. Reheat leftovers only once. The one thing I'll do for scouts, when we have leftover food, I will put that, I'll let it cool down. I'll put it in the cooler with ice overnight. And then the next day on a Sunday when I come home, I'll come right home. If it's not packed in ice, I'll actually put it in my refrigerator. And within that day, I'll put it in freezer bags. I mark it and date it. I mark what the food is. And then I mark the date that we use it. And then I put it in the freezer and I freeze it. When we take that to a camp out, and a lot of times on the one camp out for the February one, we'll throw all these different soups together. Whatever doesn't get eaten on that, we throw that away. I won't do another heating on the leftovers. I'll do leftovers one time as long as they're properly transferred. But that's my rule, is once they're cooled down at night, we usually scrape them out, put them in bags or sealer. We put them in a cooler, keep them cold like a refrigerator unit would be. I take them home, put them in another freezer container. I freeze them and mark them and date them. And that's why it's important, the data. Now, if you have a good freezer unit and they're not opened up or whatever, they're probably good for an amount of time. And my freezer I use is for meats, and that really puts a deep freeze. Those soups are in like a block, almost like a block of ice when they freeze. That food's going to be good for a while. Again, as long as you then let it thaw in the refrigerator and then you cook it within that amount of time, you're going to be fine and prevent against any food poisoning. If for foods prepared and held in a refrigerator for cooling for more than 24 hours, mark the date and preparation, just like I talked about. And if you must prepare foods in advance, make sure you're properly cool and refrigerate them. Again, it's that whole cooling down and then reheating and serving and keeping that temperature warm enough so the food that doesn't get a bacteria growth. So the infected person, again, that's pretty well self-explanatory. So if they have a cut that looks infected, that's bad. Again, and a lot of times, again, going to the bathroom, you got your E. coli, salmonella, Campylobacter. These are bacteria that make you really sick. This is what causes food poisoning. So if you have someone sick or isn't washing their hands, and a lot of times you look in a restaurant and there's signs all over the place, did you wash your hands? It is required by state law, and that's true. It's required by state law that they must wash their hands after they go to the bathroom. Because you ask any kind of, doctor that handles with a lot of that, it's urine and your feces have a bacteria that helps it break down. We learned that in the last week's review of the sewer plants. So that bacteria is on that. So if it gets on your hands, guess what? You're putting it on the food, and that food's going to grow it because it loves that food to grow. And so just like it breaks down your poop, it's going to try to grow on the food and break that down, and that's when you get sick. So to prevent the problems, make sure all food handlers wash their hands, and they should wash their hands very thoroughly and before they go. And some handlers will wear gloves as well, but the problem with gloves is a lot of times if you're going from meat to fruit and vegetables or back and forth, most preparers are going to be on one system. They're going to be handling the cooking in the meat and the preparation, and then they're going to switch gloves, wash their hands, and if they go to vegetables. But a lot of times when they put them on a station, they stay in that station for the evening if they have enough preparers. So food handlers that have cuts in their hands or infections, they have to be completely sealed with a waterproof bandage. If they're just cuts, that's one thing. Now, if they have an infection on their hand, they have to go to a doctor and be on antibiotics and not be handling food. So that's just basically if you're at work and I cut my finger, you have to put pressure, get the bleeding stopped, seal it up. And for food preparation, you have to put a waterproof kind of bandage on, and then you use gloves as well. So that's not a contamination with it. And if it's a really bad glove, then they're going to have to get medical attention. We talked about the glove things. And food handlers with infection symptoms must not handle utensils or food and should be sent home. So there is very few people that, it's different if they go and say, hey, I don't know, I have a little runny nose. I'm not really feeling sick. They might just have them doing some paperwork in the back or something like that. But if they show up, they're not going to be greeting customers, not going to be handling food, and they're going to be sent home. And that's just something restaurants can't handle. When possible, avoid direct hand contact with food, especially ready-to-eat foods like plastic utensils, plastic latex gloves. Again, as long as you're washing your hands, in some of these cases, you're fine, but they just have to make sure you're washing. rinsing them, putting them under water real quick, that is not washing your hands. We're talking about now with the virus, it takes 20 seconds to thoroughly wash your hands with soap and water. And you want to go get the lathered up, and you're going to physically go between it, get your thumbs and around that, and you want to repeat that for 20 seconds. And that's getting all the little nooks and crannies of your fingers. People that are into Fail Energy, nails are very important. If you have long nails and you have dirt under them, you don't want to be working in the garden with long nails and then go and handle food at the work. All that dirt has anaerobic bacteria, and that's how people can get sick. So those are fundamental things. Food handling, you got to have clean hands. Okay, so we talked about inadequate reheating for hot holding. That's where the food has to be heated hot enough that when it goes to the handler, and again, these are in the buffet where the food's sitting in these troughs and it's heated. And a lot of times they have like steam underneath, the hot water, and that's going to keep it at a certain temperature. But that food needs to be cooked thoroughly before it gets put in that, because some of those handlers aren't heating it enough. Now, some I've seen where it's so hot, you got to worry that you could burn your mouth. So some are really warm, but there's also some that they might not necessarily be that hot, so they have to be cooked before they go out there. And we talked about temperature-wise, it listed right there. Again, food should be cooked, they say is 165 for meats and certain foods, and then it should be also cooked and heated for a certain amount of time. You know, microwave is the one thing they talk about there. So when you do it in a microwave, if you notice it, if it has a turntable, that's better than if it just sits. If your turntable doesn't work, you should try to get that working, because the problem with the microwave, it doesn't heat the electrons in the food equally. So what you have to do is stop it, go in, stir it up, mix it around, heat it again. And what they usually recommend is about 3 heating times to make sure, and then you're supposed to check the meat or food that it's at a certain temperature. A lot of times when you heat microwave, it just gets to be lukewarm or slightly warm but not hot. And if you're serving that to a restaurant, now a lot of times, you know, if you had a leftover burger last night, you properly cool it and you heat it up and it's not scalding, you're probably going to be okay if that was fresh. But if you have food that's in there for a few days, you really do want to make sure that the microwave, you're stopping it a few times, stirring it up, that it should be hot. It should come out steaming. You know it's hot. Then you let it cool for a few minutes, and then you can eat it with it. So that's important with the microwave. A lot of times people throw it in there and they think it's good to go. That's why convection microwaves are really good, because you're actually going to cook it thoroughly through, and that's actually a little more efficient than just using a microwave for just about a minute. So the other, number 5, improper hot holding. We just talked about that. Number 5, which is similar to what we talked about, the other thing in the danger zones, is if they're not warm enough to keep it or not cooked enough there, which we'll just go through that. Contaminated raw food, we talked about that, how to prevent that. Again, raw oysters, raw eggs, like in a Caesar salad. Again, what you want to do is, I like medium rare hamburgers, and if there's restaurants around, I know I can handle it. I have no problem, because I know they're getting fresh meat and they're handling it properly, and I've never had a problem with that. You want to buy your foods or ingredients from an approved supplier. That's one thing with restaurants. Sometimes if you're starting to get these ingredients from these, I would say, less qualified or state kind of mandated run, that can be an issue. If you're getting these foods, you don't know how they're handled, you don't know how they're processed. Some people want to know where the meat's coming from other countries, farm raised, things like that, antibiotics, antibacterials. We talk about organic and things like that, and that's fine when it comes to that. My main thing is for you guys, unless you have allergies and stuff, is if you're going to be eating some of this raw food, you got to make sure the restaurant's following protocol and they're getting their food from a legitimate place. Also, it talks about processed or pasteurized alternatives. Sometimes you can pasteurize certain things and you don't have to worry about it. But when you're eating some of the raw food, you really do want to make sure that's a really good restaurant knows how to handle it. But there are outbreaks when you hear sometimes of certain restaurants that have an outbreak, and it probably comes from either where they got it from or how they handled it, or again, that they weren't keeping it cold enough, and that's what caused the infection. Unsafe source, that's again where you're getting the supply from. There's overnight suppliers. You get these food trucks, I know, in cities. There was a run, I know, in New York, where sometimes you'd have these meat places that would pop up. Hey, I got this deal on this meat and this beef. We want to sell it cheaper. And as a restaurant, you can't take that risk. You got to make sure that these are coming from a qualified butcher, a food processor, and it's not being shipped in from some country that doesn't have mandated policies like we have for the FDA and other food processors. So that's one thing is when you get something cheap, that's exactly what you might be getting. So you have to be careful, especially in the restaurant business. So we'll talk over number 8, use of leftovers. Again, the main thing is letting it cool as it hits that danger zone, not more than 2 hours to where it's not hot anymore. Put it on a good sealed container with a lid, get it back into a refrigerator, and then it'll get it out. It'll drop below the danger zone in that 4 hours, and then you know it's safe to reheat again. But the main thing is heating that to a temperature that completely gets it hot enough that there was any bacteria that grew, that heating process will kill it. So it's not, if you get a container out and you open it, such as fish and meat, and it has something growth on it or a smell, you got to throw that out. Just because you cook it doesn't mean you're going to get enough of that bacteria killed. So that's something to keep in mind, especially with your animal products. You got to be really careful with that. And number 9, cross-contamination. Again, when I take things for scouts, I usually will have a cooler for my meat or animal products. And then I sometimes with a larger group, I have 3 coolers. I'll have meat, and then one I'll have fruits and vegetables, and then the other one I'll have some other ones that are in between, let's say lunch meat and cheese and things like that. I don't want that necessarily with the fruit and vegetables, but I also don't want it with the raw meat. So I usually have one cooler for just raw meat. Now, if things are in a sealed container, you're probably going to be okay. I do have some sealed bags that if it's a smaller camp out, I'll have a bunch of meat in a sealed bag on one divide, and another thing is some other thing that is kept completely separate. But again, I won't have fruits and vegetables in with that, or eggs as well. I'll keep that in another container. And I always want to make sure as I put some cooler units on top, and then I put them on top. I put less, I usually try not to use ice. The reason being is when it melts, that liquid will run. If there's any meat that's leaking out, that water will then run over to the other side of the cooler. And that's the main reason where you don't want to have contaminated products in there, such as fruits and vegetables, raw meat, because that water will run and it'll contaminate. It'll get into some of those containers. Sometimes I'll get a new sealed container, such as glass or a hard plastic, and then I put it in so I know it can't leak out of that. So again, some of the other thing is handling the raw fields, how to handle them, keep it warm, or clean cloth. And also it talks about bleach. We're going to talk about how to go through and clean on a campsite and the proper ways of doing it. We always have, when we're washing dishes again, we have the 3, we have hot suds, we have the rinsing on another, and then we have the bleach at the end. That goes and cleans our pots and pans and dishes, and that's important too, just for the cleaning up those utensils, because if you don't thoroughly wash them on a hot enough temperature, getting off the grease or other products that could have animal products or other things, if they're not completely bleached or cleaned, that can left off, and if you use them again for dinner, now you're in that danger zone for the last 4 or 5 hours that bacteria was growing. So something to keep in mind. That's why it's important that you guys take that cleaning of those utensils and everything seriously. Also, contamination, I forgot, also is when it comes to allergies, peanut allergies. When people have allergies, we got to make sure that there's none of those things are coming on the camp out. And as far as using cutting boards, the one thing, knives and cutting boards should be used for, like, say, like either fish, poultry, or meat, and that will not be used then. That has to be taken away and cleaned and scrubbed right away. It cannot be used for, say, onions, broccoli, or other fruits and vegetables. So you want to use separate cutting boards, separate knives. If they get cross-contaminated, they both immediately have to be washed, and you have to transfer them out and get fresh stuff. So that's also part of contamination, is keeping the flippers, the handling when you're making meat or stirring something up. And also then the other thing is the cutters and the boards that you use for it. Now, once everything's in the pot for the Dutch oven, I use a fresh stir, and then we're stirring everything in the pot. That's where you're going to use it from there out. But when you're actually preparing it, you got to make sure you're using different equipment until it gets to that cooking spot. Okay, inadequate cooking, number 10, the last on the thing. So a lot of times, like when we do Dutch oven, if you ever look in that Dutch oven, that stuff's boiling. I mean, it's really gets hot. So I really don't have, as long as we've done all the steps in cooking each product, when that sits in that Dutch oven, it's going 30, 45 minutes, an hour. I know that stuff's cooked, and any bacteria that's in there is killed. Now, the main thing, after we're done with that, we let it cool for a little bit. And again, it takes about 2 hours. If it's colder, it's going to be a little quicker. Then we have to put in the sealed container and get it into one of the coolers or refrigerator unit at that point, so we can preserve that food if we have leftovers. But the main thing for cooking is getting it to an adequate temperature. And if it is going to cool down, letting it cool down and stay out of that danger zone. Okay. So most common foodborne illnesses, some of this we talked about. What are foodborne illnesses that are common, can be life-threatening. Sometimes they can just make you really sick, but in some cases they can be very significant. There has been outbreaks, and sometimes you get recalls into certain food services. We talk about bacteria like Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli, or even viruses such as novovirus or hepatitis A. So these are viruses, and that can even expand, but bacteria is a common thing in the food industry. Symptoms range. A lot of times you're going to have upset stomach if it's mild, or diarrhea. If it is food poisoning and the bacteria grows, usually within anywhere between 4 to sometimes they say 12 hours, you're going to get usually vomiting and those kind of things. If you get severely dehydrated, you do have to go to a hospital and get some IV fluids because for people that are immunocompromised, elderly individuals, especially pregnant women, that can be very challenging from the child. And so you got to be monitored a little closer. If you're young and healthy, sometimes you can be okay, but I know some people that really get sick. I had a case of food poisoning once, and it was pretty significant. It took me almost a full day till I got better. It was one of the few times I ever missed work. That was not fun. And mine actually came from, I had eggplant Parmesan, and the one piece was soft. I really didn't think about it. I got sick, and the next day what I thought about is they probably use an egg stuff that they're dipping it in. And what they were doing is probably using that during the day. And what happened was it was in that danger zone, and that piece didn't get cooked enough. And that's what probably got me. But the other thing I'm worried about, when I called them and I told them about it, I wanted to make sure they weren't using the egg thing from one day to the next. If they use it on Saturday, we went there on Sunday. And if they were using that leftover, it's sitting there all day, and someone's, well, I got a big egg mixture. I don't want to waste this, so I'll just stick it back in the refrigerator. If it's sitting out, that's kind of get thrown out. So that was the one thing I learned my lesson for. If something comes out and it's not cooked, instead of being crispy, it's soft, you got to tell them this isn't cooked thoroughly. You got to send it back. I'll never do that again. So that was my lesson I learned from it. So who's at risk? A lot of times there are people that are higher risk. I've talked about that: pregnant women, young women, older individuals, or with a weak immune system, especially people under cancer treatment or have any kind of blood conditions such as anemia and other things. The CDC says that estimates there are about 48 million cases of foodborne illnesses every year. 48 million. Now, again, that can just come home and you have gas or an upset stomach all the way to mild diarrhea or soft stool, all the way you're throwing up or end up in the hospital. So 48 million per year, that's pretty extensive. So it's out there a lot more than we know. We'll kind of fly through the bacteria. I think we talked about this. E. coli, as we know, is a bacteria cause it. There is E. coli that can be in fresh water and lakes that can occur. Again, this a lot of times will expand in a restaurant. Why? Because people are not when they're handling the bathroom. That's the biggest cause of that. Campylobacter, that's something that usually will come a lot of times from outbreaks, comes from food preparation in facilities where they have an outbreak from either somebody that isn't cleaning the processing material or things like that. A lot of times that can be from contaminated water, which you have to worry about third world countries and they're sending us food. This is a very common outbreak of Campylobacter in these countries where they're not using clean water. Unpasteurized milk, again, we pasteurize our milk, so it's usually not an issue. But again, in some countries, they don't do it. It's just something you got to be aware of when you're eating outside of the country. Again, we talk about nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, or even bloody diarrhea and cramps. This can be very devastating. This is something, this food poisoning can actually kill you. So this is something to be aware of. This can be pretty heavy on somebody who's, and even if you're not immunocompromised, it can make you really sick. Salmonella is another thing. You hear about salmonella outbreaks. Again, this is a very common recall. You heard certain things. A lot of times this will be something that contaminated in the food preparation when they're, say, cutting up the broccoli, sending it in bags or sealing it. Maybe the machines got contaminated, a worker's hands or something like that. Again, a lot of times it's not washing or cleaning your food preparation area. The knives you use weren't maybe washed or things like that. And that's something occur. Again, the same symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramping, and fever. And that can last a few days. Sometimes the salmonella, you won't get over it in just a day. Some of the other ones, You might get sick, throw up, but this one here can linger on for a few days up to a week. A lot of times comes from meats and eggs. Eggs is a very common thing. Mayonnaise, if you go to a cookout, someone uses mayonnaise in the potato salad. They don't have it sitting in ice. It's sitting in the sun all day. Again, you're in that danger zone. And you're like, look at just half the potato salad. Let's scrape it back in the container, put it in the fridge. We'll have it tomorrow. But once that sits in there for 24 hours, and let's say your fridge isn't cold enough, you're not going to feel good, because guess what? You don't warm up potato salad. You're just going to eat it cold. So you're going to get sick. So that can be a cause of, say, summer picnics. And that's why a lot of people have those chiller units. Well, they have it sit on ice, and they'll keep stirring it so it stays cold and doesn't get warm in that danger zone. So that's a good way of kind of preventing that.
One thing, Christian.
Yes.
I've eaten plenty of warm potato salad, and it's never affected me. So there.
Well, that still remains to be seen. I don't know. Maybe there's are causative factors. But you're right. I mean, you can. And the thing with potato salad, if you eat it when it's first made, it's not going to make you sick. Most of the time, the potato salad is when people use it for leftovers and it's sitting out, and then they put it back in the refrigerator and they get it out and eat it the next day or two. So that's a lot of times where the preparation is okay. But again, if you're putting eggs in it and you have dairy products in the mayonnaise, you now have two components that can cause salmonella. So that's why I would have to say potato and egg salad might be the most common thing of food poisoning when it comes to summer picnics. So something to keep in mind. You want to invite the cousin who really knows how to prepare the potato salad and keep it cold before it comes out on the table. So one of the things, enteric fever, some of the cases will actually get so bad that you can get more of an infection and a fever and get pretty sick. This usually occurs when you travel outside of the country, and you can get what's called typhoid fever. These are more severe. And this is something when you're traveling, you want to speak to your doctor. When you're traveling to a third world country, there are some countries that you do have to worry about more of an aggressive salmonella that can give you a typhoid fever reaction. And this is where you actually get it in your blood. So that can be a pretty significant condition as opposed to just getting a upset stomach or even throwing up. This is a pretty more aggressive thing. You can get vaccinated in areas if you're traveling to an area that have a very high typhoid fever, and that'll prevent against that. But it is more of a short vaccination you want to do right before your trip, and that's where we want to talk to an epidemiologist or an infectious disease doctor who knows when to vaccinate before your trip, Bacteria foodborne illnesses, again, listeria is another one. This isn't one you hear about as much, but it's out there. Again, it's one of those things. You get food poisoning. Everybody usually calls it Salmonella, E. coli, but listeria does exist. You have invasive one, which is more deadly, and that's where it'll actually go into your gut or even your brain or your blood. You can almost get what they call a meningitis from it. So this can be pretty fatal. So you might not hear about this as much because a lot of people don't even report mild food poisoning or mild sickness. But this is one, when it does get it, hospitals have to report this to the CDC. Pregnant women, that is something, it can actually be so aggressive that can cause a miscarriage or stillbirth. So it actually gets into the plasma that goes to the baby. It's through the umbilical cord, and that's where it's very devastating to the baby. So this is something that this is not something that we probably see that much, but it does exist. Again, good hand washing, and also, again, the 40-degree temperature, keeping raw foods away from cooked foods. And again, unpasteurized raw milk. And that's when I usually see it in third world countries a lot of time, again, is that unpasteurized milk. And, I grew up on a farm. We grew milk that it would separate. So it wasn't homogenized. It wasn't pasteurized. I didn't die, but we were getting it literally right from the cow, and it would cool down. We were getting it, bottling it, and drinking within a few days. That nowadays we pasteurize everything, and when you do travel in other countries, this is one of those infection third world countries. If they're not handling their milk product, this is something that can get you pretty sick. So again, you got to know where you're traveling to in order to be protected against these type. Novovirus is another thing, a virus that can cause contaminated food. Is something to be aware of, and also hepatitis A. Again, hepatitis A goes from stool to mouth. So not keeping food out of, saying, when there's water contaminated with the sewer system, it'll then can go, if they're using watering to water their food, such as fruits and vegetables, and that has it on it, and then it's not washed thoroughly and processed, that's where hepatitis A outbreaks can occur, is when it's contaminated water. And when you look at these videos in some of these countries where they have a bunch of shrimp that's in it and they're actually putting feces in to have those shrimp sterilized, do not get shrimp from those countries, all right? Because chances are there's probably hepatitis in there. So I just want to tell you that that's one thing you want to know, where some of your shellfish and other things are going. And it's great to want to support some of these countries, but if they're going to be doing growing shrimp and crawfish in that kind of unregulated manner, that's not something you want to be eating. Because if they process them and freeze them and then you thaw them and you don't cook them properly, boom, you got it. So that's something to be aware of. Final thought for foodborne illnesses and the CDC estimate every year in the United States, 76 million people suffer from foodborne illnesses. Now, the other thing it talked about, 48, this includes everything that can come from any other condition that's dealt with food. So that's why that number is actually even higher. And this is a recent number I got. So 76 million for foodborne illnesses. That is a lot of people. How many of them are severe? That's, of course, a lot less, but it's just something to be aware of. And then 325,000 people get hospital per year. And again, that fluctuates from year to year, but the number is somewhat stable when I looked at a few years. And about 5,000 people die a year through foodborne illnesses. Again, some of those conditions that are more extensive. And if you're compromised, again, that's where you're more at risk, either very young or very old, or you have some illness as well. And basically what the thought is, by just washing your hands, most of these illnesses in our country that handles and processes food properly, pasteurizes milk, handles cheese a certain way, most of these things can be prevented by just simply washing your hands. So that's an important thing, and especially now with this virus, I can't hammer that home enough at this point. So just to get the message through, hand washing. I wanted to have 2 slides on that. So when you guys are doing it, when we have you guys as scouts, we're like, hey, did you wash your hands? That's why we tell you to do that, just in case you decided, well, I was doing this. I was like putting my hands in mud, and then I started cutting the chicken. This is why you got to wash your hands. All right. So very important. All right. So we're talking about pollution and public health. We'll go to the next subject here. So some of the things we talk about: air pollutants, water pollutants, noise pollutants, okay? And as we go from severity down, we talk about noise pollutants. However, this is something to be aware of in a work environment that can be very harmful to the human body. But we talk about air pollutants, and it's something, when you look at the numbers, I know in the United States, they were having a really problem in the 70s. There was waterways that were polluted. There was airways. Los Angeles was horrible. We had so much smog. And we basically turned it around to get some of the cleanest air and water that we've ever had pretty well in the United States over the last few years. We have done really well on all these systems to protect their, and that's one thing the World Health Organization is doing, is the main thing is trying to get clean water from more countries that separates from their sewer, and there's still countries out there that don't have that. Some of the things that are now pollutants, we talk about sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, VOCs, carbon monoxide, particulates. This is in factories that maybe years ago would actually put out certain components. You talk about toxic or heavy metal dust. That's something in New York. I had a few cases in the shipyards from people back in the around after the Second War, where they were grinding all these barnacles and other stuff off the bottom of ships. That wasn't a problem as much as the gas, but they were using chemicals to clean off these boats. Those chemicals will get in their bloodstream, either mercury or other things, and they're very good at cleaning off the bottom of the boat so they wouldn't ruin the metal or the boards from getting it off. The problem is it got in their bloodstream, and a lot of people are getting nerve conditions, paralysis, neuropathies, things like that from some of these cleaning agents they use because they didn't wear a mask. So it can be a gas form, it can be a liquid form, but if it gets on your body, your skin is permeable, and eventually that will come through your skin and can cause toxic doses. Radioactive gases, ozone, pathogens, these are all things. Some of the related conditions we talked, basically straightforward, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, asthma, emphysema, cystic fibrosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma. You see commercials from lawyers on that all the time. And that was created by asbestosis that was in a lot of older homes or in factories. They'd go in and blast these factories out, re-wall them, and that was in the air. When I worked at Department of Environmental Resources as an internship between my college years, I actually did a analysis on those fibers that cause mesothelioma, and they look like long needles is what these will get in. They get into your lungs, they get stuck in the lung tissue, and the body forms these masses around it. And your lungs can never get rid of it. It's stuck in there permanently, and it causes chronic inflammation, which then leads to lung cancer. So this asbestosis was pretty well a high rate of cancer that occurred because those needles, understand, it just looks like someone gets a sewing needle, sticks in your lung tissue. So it's pretty interesting when I did that study. I can understand why this never gets out of your lungs. It talks about pneumonia, bronchitis, allergies, Legionnaire or carbon monoxide poisoning. And some of these conditions, what happens as you keep breathing them in, it doesn't maybe get you sick right away. And in fact, you hope it does get you sick so you know you're being contaminated. Carbon monoxide, a lot of times you just want to take a nap, and that can occur. There's sometimes if it gets high in your home, and that's why it's good to have monitors. But if your house or where you're staying is near one of these factories and the carbon monoxide gets high, you just want to take a nap and you'll never wake up. But in some of these conditions, you get sick right away, but a lot of them, it occurs over time, and it's that chronic exposure to that where it damages your lungs. And a lot of people then have breathing problems where their lungs never function and they're on oxygen the rest of their life, and they usually have complications then that usually will end their life early just because of these chronic conditions they're exposed to. So a lot of work in environments now, what the factories are turning out, filters, cleaning agents, diluting, something that takes that out of the air. So it's not even going around the factory, but it's also not coming out of the factory places, because some of these conditions were in the factory. Now all this stuff gets monitored, and we have agencies in every working place that is making sure this doesn't occur. Water pollutants of concern, talks about pathogens. We talked about all these different things that grow in water. Heavy metals, that's something over time that builds up and they want to be cleared out. Pesticides, disinfectant, byproduct, petroleum, hydrocarbons. Pesticides, another thing is, I know in Lake Meade they had a restriction of some of the numbers we could use on fertilizer, but a lot of farms and other areas where there's water runoff, that accumulates and then does go down to the Chesapeake Bay, and that's what's changed the environment was a lot of the pesticides and fertilizers we used over the years that accumulates and adds up, and that's why some of what's growing in the Chesapeake, it's a different environment for a lot of the creatures down there now, and it'll never be the same probably. Related health conditions, asthma, COPD, emphysema, cystic fibrosis, cancer, pneumonia, bronchitis. Noise pollutions, again, earbud use, industrial transportation, shooting sports, and household. Even mowing your yard. If you have a really loud mower, it should be wearing earphones. Anything you're doing, blowers, anything you're doing, or constantly just something at work, or grinding. I usually try to wear earpieces, because if you do it more than a few minutes, it will eventually wear. For kids, when you guys are walking around, I try to tell my two boys, I don't like both earpieces in. I like one in, one out, and I don't want to hear it. If I can hear it, it's too loud in your ear. Because eventually, as you get older, you're going to lose that hearing if you blast. You might think it's cool when you're younger, but if you keep doing it, your ears are basically get overload, and the mechanics inside those ears, they won't work as well, and you'll lose your hearing. That's why a lot of times any kind of industrial where you're around the sound, or if you're doing jobs at the house, or if like earbuds right now, I see the kids walking around with them, you really got to keep the volume down. You can hear it much better when it's in your ear, so you don't have to blast it like you would when it's outside and you're out in your yard and you're just hearing it from a few feet away. So something to keep in mind. What you do to your bodies now can add up, and you don't want to be sitting there and asking everybody why, because you can't hear them anymore in a room full of other voices. So the conditions there is hearing loss. And in some cases, though, these chronic sounds, there's been studies that show that it can lead to anxiety and depression if they're at these jobs. It actually gets so overwhelming to their brain. It's a stimulus, and they actually can have some conditions such as, again, depression or anxiety. So there are some studies about that. And there's been military studies that if you want to torture somebody by doing high pitch or varied sounds, it actually can lead to brain damage. So it's kind of interesting, with that. And I think there was that one thing Charlie reminded me is where down in Cuba there was some accusations that occurred that there was some kind of high pitched sound that was making people sick. So, you know, I don't know whatever came out of that research or whatever, but that was an interesting thing that I saw. This was probably about a year or two ago, I think, if I remember right. But all right. So we talked about chronic disease and health behavior issues. So chronic disease, that goes, the most common ones we know are obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And what's the main reason? Another reason I put it up, these are the 5 conditions that the coronavirus is actually attacking. When you're looking at the death rate in a lot of elderly individuals, these 5 things, when you look at obesity, and then you look at another thing is hypertension or high blood pressure or prior heart disease or stroke, and then diabetes. If you have two of these, it's increased risk, and you have 3 of them, it even goes higher. So we're finding a lot of the deaths in people that are of a certain age usually have these factors, about 90-some%. So if you're healthy, if you're older and you're healthy, you actually don't have that much more risk. But if you have these other conditions, that's why the risk is there. But not only is it just for viruses and illnesses, but if you get any of these conditions, if you get mild food poisoning and you have uncontrolled diabetes, it's going to make you a lot more sick, because when you're throwing up, your blood sugar is going to be all erratic. If you have heart disease, it stresses your heart when you're sick. If you have diarrhea, if you're under cancer treatment, you're usually dehydrated. So that's the reason that any of these food diseases or any of these other things we talked about is going to be more stressful. Health behaviors, we talk about diet and nutrition, physical activity, smoking, alcohol consumption. Again, when you eat right and you exercise and keep your weight down, you're going to do much better. When you add carcinogens like smoking, that affects your blood pressure, the way your arteries flow, the way your heart works, and also alcohol consumption chronically. And I'm not talking about having, as an adult and over 21, of course, but we're going to talk about excessive drinking on a regular basis. That's where alcohol comes into play. Health effects caused by smoking. All right. Again, I'm going to present all this stuff, and I'm not going to lecture, but I'm going to say there's some bad stuff with smoking. All right. And they're finding now with the whole vaping thing. At first, they said there was some pathogens that was in the vapor. They weren't sure it was in the liquid. And now they just came out with a study that cardiovascular, there is actually no decrease from vaping than what it is from smoking. And I knew eventually, because again, it's a lot of times it's with tobacco and nicotine. That's what's going to get you. So that study came out. So people that are vaping, they think it's cool. It's not going to affect them. It's safer than smoking. It's not true. The study shows it's just as harmful. So it's a trendy thing. These companies are getting away from it. And I think now as the truth comes out, it's just something you can't do. Smoking leads to disease and disability, affects every organ in the body, almost nearly every organ. And I'm talking, there's very few that aren't affected by smoking. The main reason, because it decreases blood supply to your organs. And that's one of the main reasons. It's a vasoconstrictor, and it results in cholesterol deposits inside your arteries, and your small vessels go to your kidneys, your brain, your liver. All those things are all affected. Every person who dies because of smoking, at least 30 people live with a serious related smoking disease. So for everybody who dies, there's about 30 people. You got a question, Charlie?
I just want to say, when I was in the Navy, I was 2.5 packs of cigarettes a day. All right. It took me years to quit.
Yeah.
And
Very
I'm
addictive.
right now feeling the effects. I go out walking, you know, but I'm short of breath. You think, oh, I'm young, I can do anything, I will survive it. Well, if you live as old as I am, and good chances you will, you know, it's going to come back, and then you'll be thinking, God, why didn't I take better care of myself? I mean, I've been 255 pounds twice, smoked relentlessly, you know, and I say that's one thing. You think you're invincible when you're young. You get my age, you're pounding yourself in the head, going, "Why did I do such stupid things when I was young? Because I'm paying the price now." I'm sorry. That's all.
Well,
I'm sorry.
and in self-defense of that, Charlie, I mean, that's a great point. You know, years ago, they didn't know how harmful smoking was. And the companies, of course, hid it for a long time. And that's why the lawsuits came out. But, you know, I know a lot of veterans, when I was at the VA, they used to have drop zones. What they got, some food, a lot of cigarettes and magazines. And because they used to use them to gamble and pay off debt. Hey, clean the outhouse for me because I'll give you a pack of cigarettes. You know, I mean, it was just the way, it was almost like a cash exchange. But it just wasn't understood. World War II, Korea, you know, they just didn't know about the extent of it. Now there's really no excuse for it. But, you know, in all self-defense, you know, I don't think I knew too many veterans, Charlie, that probably didn't smoke during their military service before a certain year. I mean, it was just a common thing. Your rations included food and cigarettes. You know, you guys would give it to them. I mean, it was like almost like a passage, you know, a rite of passage. You get your cigarettes.
You talk to Sam Coover. he'll tell you the drug of choice now in the prisons is cigarettes, because all federal and state buildings cannot smoke. So how do they hide the fact that they're smoking? He told us that they take a Windex bottle, put half bleach, half water, and they spray it in their mouth. Do you know what bleach does to your gums and teeth?
Oh, yeah.
These guys are walking around without any teeth now, all because they have to smoke cigarettes.
Yeah, it's going to cause chronic gingivitis, basically. That just erodes all the gum lining around your teeth, and your teeth are going to rot out. Oh, my. That's it. Right. So that's how they hide. One other thing,
when you guys are old and you're saying, why didn't I listen to Charlie? Remember that. I'll come back and haunt you.
He's the example to acknowledge there, everyone. So again, we talked about smoking. What does it cause? Cancer, heart disease, stroke, lung disease, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, emphysema, chronic bronchitis. They all sound fun, right, everyone? It sounds great. Smoking increased risk for tuberculosis, certain eye disease, problem with the immune system, including rheumatoid arthritis. And I think more studies are going to come out. I've always felt this a long time. I felt when I was at the VA, people who smoked, you would actually see, when I would do amputations in the VA, we would do what's called a guillotine. Sometimes we just cut it off in the front of the foot. It took a good 3 days until all of a sudden the blood flow would return. So we'd have very minimal dressings on, and after about 2.5, 3 days, because they're stuck in the ICU or hospital, they couldn't smoke. And literally the difference was all those vessels dilated. By the 3rd day, if we didn't have a bulky dressing on, it would bleed all over the bed. That's how more bleeding they had. So that was the one thing I really saw. How much constriction of your vessels does it do? And it was unbelievable. By that 3rd day of not getting smoke in your body, how that bleeding would increase, and it would increase their healing. But unfortunately, as they started feeling better, they would take breaks and go down and smoke outside the VA. And they had a smoking area there, which used to drive me crazy because they actually allowed it there. So once they started smoking, their healing didn't do as well. But at least when we could keep them in the hospital and in a bed without smoking, it actually improved their healing. So it makes a big difference. Secondhand smoke exposure contributes about 41 deaths among non-smoking adults and 400 deaths in infants each year. So that's an important thing. A lot of times, I smoke in the house, it's my right. You got to keep in mind is if you're doing it with other people in the house, you got to really do it away, not inside the house. It goes into the, a lot of the material, the upholstery, the walls, a lot of places that some of these restaurants used to be smoking. They had to gut the inside material because it just still smelled like smoke. But this secondhand smoke, and in some cases, if you're blowing out and you're a smoker, sometimes the secondhand smoke is actually more intense than what you're breathing in if you're blowing it all out. Now, if you take it fully in your lungs, then you're getting exposed to it. But again, 41,000 deaths they estimate and 400 deaths in infants a year. And SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, is it's something they still feel strongly about that was linked to smoking. And I still agree with that. Secondhand smoke caused by stroke, lung cancer, coronary artery disease in adults. Children who are exposed to secondhand smoke are at increased risk of sudden in-death syndrome, acute respiratory infections, middle ear infections, more severe asthma, respiratory symptoms, and slow lung growth. And the one thing, when I did family practice, my 3rd year of residency, and I actually worked in a family practice for about 2 months. And what I saw, and I would always ask the parents, do you smoke? I'm just curious. And again, I wasn't trying to, really judge or anything else like that. And I found for a lot of kids who came in for repeat sinus infections and ear infections, I found there was somebody in their house that was smoking. And I found that 100% of the time. Now, I'm not talking about the rare one, but the ones that kept getting these infections back, I always found there was a smoker in the house somewhere. So that was something I always learned through my training. So again, I'm not here to lecture anybody. I'm just giving you the facts of something I saw. So that's why I don't smoke, Here's some pictures of it, going through chemo. The lady to the left there, she's dealing with cancer, lung cancer is what her condition was. Also colon cancer, breast cancer. Besides lung cancer, I feel colon cancer is increasingly risk too, because you're still getting that in your body and you're pushing through, and that can go through digestive system. Anybody who's pregnant is more exposed to these things. We look at the upper hand right, she could be dealing with asthma, emphysema, COPD. And the gentleman to the far right, there you go, chronic oxygen. You got to tank this thing around, charge it. You got to be walking around, and you're not going to be walking around a block too fast at that point. So it's just something. Now, unfortunately, some individuals I know in my practice, they have bad lungs because where they work, the factories and all that kind of stuff before they changed years ago. And those are the people I really feel bad for because it really wasn't anything that they did. It's just something, it was the work environment they're around, but that can lead to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, pneumonitis, all those kind of things. And these people are always, every year, they get the influenza, the pneumococcal fight. I always feel they always get one case of bronchitis and pneumonia each year. It's rare that somebody who has lung damage doesn't get these infections because your body can't fight it as well. So we talk about health dangers, abusing reaction, illegal drugs. Again, this is pretty all straightforward. So they say, well, I just use drugs every now and then. I'm telling you, there's not a study that I can't find that doesn't relate that it kills brain cells. And when we say that it's going to kill brain cells, it does kill your brain cells, and those cells don't come back. We only use a percentage of your brain. So you might think, well, it'll just kill the brain cells like don't use. Well, it doesn't work like that. You're actually going to kill the brain cells you use. So, and the one thing I'm going to talk about is marijuana, and I'm going to go on a tangent here. This is something that's a gateway drug. And what are we finding is, and they're saying as adults, they're using it, the addiction, all those kind of things, it's going to be legalized for chronic conditions. And I'm fine with cancer, chronic arthritis, neuropathy, seizures, things like that. I understand it. When it's used in a medical form and it's controlled and regulated, every person who goes on medical marijuana is usually with a counselor, tells them how much to use so it doesn't get abused and it doesn't get to the point where the person is walking around high or under drugs. They're just controlling their pain. So when kids use it, and a statistic I use, for obesity, if you're obese as a child, you have a 77% chance to be obese as an adult, and that's a known fact. When you're a kid and you use drugs such as marijuana, you're actually much more likely to be addicted as an adult to a much more aggressive drug. You're going to have to go higher, opioids, heroin, cocaine, something like that. So when this whole thing is just because we're legalizing marijuana, it's kind of irritating that the states aren't talking about it. If you're a kid and you use marijuana for 4 or 5 years as your kid, there's no way you're going to stop. You're going to get addicted to that, and you're going to have to use stronger stuff. So we're going to find with years on, these states are going to have to be paying all the money they make and the revenue from this. If they legalize it, they're going to be paying for all these rehab centers for kids once they're hooked on drugs. When they're older, you're going to lose your jobs. You're not going to show up. And the one thing, if there's drugs in your system and you have an alcohol and you get tested, you're instant DUI. And that's instantaneous. You can't just say, well, I'm allowed this much or whatever. But if you have marijuana and you have beer, you are intoxicated. That's DUI immediately, even if it's only a trace in your bloodstream. And as you know, marijuana stays in your blood, in your cells for a long time, up to 30 days. If you're on certain medications, barbiturates and things like that as an adult, if you have alcohol or marijuana, again, instantly you're considered a drug user. It's an instant DUI. So when I go to these seminars and why people get busted a second or third time, sometimes they're not going and drinking and driving, but they're taking a medication or they're using another medication or a drug, marijuana, with alcohol, and that's why you get arrested. So these are important things to know, and that's why people, and this ruins your life. You know, with all these things in it, getting a lawyer, protecting yourself, not losing your work. For any DUI can cost anywhere between $7,000 to $15,000. If you're in the low range, you're in the high range, you might be looking at $30,000 to $50,000 or loss of your income. So, you know, it's things we got to go. When you're using these things as an adult, use them sensibly. And as a kid under a certain age, you guys have no reason to be doing it. It's not something you want to test, so you get familiar with it. But drugs, it's so easy to overdose. There's now stuff coming in from countries. They're laced with certain things. There's other chemicals on it. You can use it one time, die, overdose. And I've actually known kids, families that are good families, kids, the first or second time they used it, they actually end up dying. And these are real family situations and patients that are just honest with me and sincere how he was a good kid. I never thought he'd use drugs, and the first time he used it. So this is, you know, a real serious thing that kind of takes apart with me, because I've seen people arrive in the emergency room and they're dead on arrival. They're not coming back. It's too much. And it's one of those things. And once you make that decision to use a drug, and it takes your life, you can't go back. There is no redos on that. There's no second chances. So this is something we're seeing. Right now, we're getting away from the opioid crisis because of the coronavirus. But for the most part, this is something every year it gets gets worse and worse in this country, and it's something that really concerns me as a doctor. And they can crack down on us as writing prescriptions. I only write for a certain amount of pills for 2 to 3 days after surgery, and that's it. I don't write for weeks and weeks and weeks for these pain medications. But it's just something that's getting worse and worse, and I want to make a point on that tonight. So what it does to your brain, basically, the long-term problems occur even if you're not overdosing or having those immediate effects. As you keep reusing it, it will start hitting those neurons, and the transmission gets slower and slower to the point where they just are delayed in their signal, and there's less of them to actually make the connection. So with repeated use, neurons eventually die, the light bulb dims, and eventually dies out. And that's the truth. It's not something, well, if I just use it for this long or that long. It's something as you continue doing it, you know, and these certain particular drugs, illegal drugs as I'm talking, it's going to occur. Drugs mimic, and even marijuana does it. They basically stimulate what's called serotonin and dopamine centers. And as you continue relying on it, and believe it or not, cell phones also give you a little bit. It's not as high as drugs, but as you constantly have this stimulus of this dopamine, your body wants more and more and more. So as the more you get on this stuff, you want to go to more of a stimulus, more dopamine. Dopamine, that's the fun thing in life. When we hear a good joke, when a friend makes us laugh, when someone says, hey, you know, I like that shirt. That's a cool shirt. Every time you get a little hit of dopamine. And for normal things, if you have a good day, it starts from the morning when you get compliments and the things that are good things. Like, hey, I worked really hard. I got an A on that project. Man, good amount of dopamine gets released from that. It feels good, and you're proud of yourself. That's natural dopamine, and that's good. But when you're using a substitute that comes outside of your body, such as a drug, it hits those dopamine centers and it super saturates them. And so what happens when you come off of that, you want that again. And that's why you want to keep taking these drugs, because you need to feel that so good a feeling. And, well, I'm funnier when I drink, or I'm cooler. I feel more relaxed when I'm on drugs. And these are the things that people say, and it's really just a scapegoat. All right, what they have to do is improve their lives and not rely on these chemicals, because you're going to keep relying on them with it. In the frontal cortex, the cognitive growth and develop is largely affected by this. So as kids are developing, as you guys are maturing and your cells are growing, when you're using drugs, it's affecting that growth pattern, especially your brain cells. The younger, the more it's affected as proportionally as you start. So when, you know, adults are using it, it's left over. The kids think, well, my dad used it, I'll use it too. So this is why it's so deadly on younger kids, okay? So the main thing I always found too in those white areas, and they're really light, it's kind of hard to show up, but loss of impairment of memory and decision-making and a skills inhibitor. So it's impairment. And so not only when you're operating a vehicle, when you're going to work, but also your decision-making. So you're going to make poor decisions. You're going to say, you know what, I have to listen to my parents. I'm going to do this, or I'm going to have unprotected sex, or I'm going to do this. It's one bad decision after another. And as you continually use drugs, that decision process, you basically get uninhibited, and that's where these decisions compound each other. So the guy that is drinking too much, using drugs, of course they're going to get in their car and drive home, and that's what usually happens. Over time, especially younger kids, and this is another thing we're going to see, we're finding in some of the preliminary studies, kids who use marijuana in early age, what's it going to lead to? And they say it's not a problem. It's going to lead to paranoia, anxiety, and psychosis. So kids that are using it in teenage years are going to have all these mental issues, anxiety and depression and paranoia. And that's been proven to occur. So I just don't like the facts that some of the states are more interested in making revenue on doing this, on lifting the bans on it so it's not illegal, because this is what it's going to occur. The younger, the more it affects your brain cells and the way your mind's developing. And you can't handle stress at work. You can't handle a tough marriage. You can't handle a bad day. And that's where, again, it leads to bad decision making. All right. Motor function is there. When I take all my credits for Drug and Alcohol Center, because I prescribe medications and narcotics, I had this video, and they actually had, and I think it was actually in New York where they ran it. It was a local group, and they had about 10 subjects, and they let them drive this course with a car. And then they gave them basically, I think it was equivalent of 3 drinks. And they basically all failed the driving test within a short amount of time. Now, we never really found out how much food they had, how quickly they had them, but they had the drinks close together. And it was amazing how effective that driving test was there, where they're hitting cones or they're backing over a cone, they're making a turn. And I can't believe I just did it. So they actually think they're in control, but that's how much it can affect you. So that's why, even as an adult, you got to be aware of that. But when you mix your body with alcohol and marijuana, or you're on some kind of anxiety medication, when they mix, the double potency of together is what makes the potency, and that affects your driving skills. So that's why in the state of Pennsylvania, if you're on another chemical and you're on alcohol, you are now an immediate DUI because you don't have those motor skills to drive a vehicle. And I want to emphasize that. So you can't say, I didn't know that, officer. It's in your mind, you get pulled over, you're at fault. There's nobody else's fault. So it's time that you stop making excuses for what your activity is. So how it affects our health, drugs and physical health. A drug-dependent user does not often care about how to obtain a drug or how to result for it. So it leads to really bad, poor decision. In some cases, somebody will do anything. They'll steal $20 out of their grandmother's purse. They'll take, a 10 sitting in their dad's dresser. They'll take something from the family and they'll sell it. So they keep making these bad decisions until all of a sudden the parents realize, wow, $10,000 missing our drug. I didn't realize our kid was stealing from us. So again, just bad decisions, especially on the stronger drugs. When it comes down, you're willing to hurt everybody around you just to keep your drug addiction. And that's a true addict. Sharing needles. Again, we talk about diseases, HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, and that's a known thing. And all those other different bacterial infections we learned about all come from sharing needles. Because one inhibits your inhibitors, it talks about sexually transmitted diseases, communicable diseases as well, and also, of course, pregnancy and things like that, making that happen. So again, it makes you lead to poor decisions. Physical health problems, cardiovascular, respiratory, gastrointestinal problems, and they can be severe. I found drug users, we saw a video of this one guy who by the time he became an alcoholic to where he was basically drinking one full vodka in the morning and one at night, and that's what he needed. Your body craves it. You break down your body mass, your proteins, you go into organ failure. His stomach, if he ate just a simple bite of something, he'd immediately throw up. The only thing he was living on was alcohol. Of course, he went to a rehab center and he never made it. He never made it out of recovery and he died in rehab. That's how bad it is. Because when you have to bring him off the alcohol so slow and counteract that, you can't pull out of it. That was a really sad story. Drug abuse and adults have ailments that can last for years. And in some cases, you can mess up your stomach so bad, your GI system will never be the same. You ruin all that good bacteria in it and all your stomach linings, and especially the small blood vessels to your lining. If you're both alcohol and drugs, usually a lot of people have permanent inability to digest food, and it can be either loss of weight, very skinny, never healthy again, or very excessive weight can occur. So again, higher risk of heart disease, heart attack, strokes, and breathing abnormalities. All right. So excessive alcohol use. Where am I at? Almost getting to the time here. Let me see. So we talked about it, and I talked about some of the things with alcohol as well, and that's why I wanted to talk about that with it. So I'll just finishing up. Short-term health, we talk about injuries, motor vehicle violence. Again, a lot of times, spouse abuse, things like that can occur. Again, making bad decisions, alcohol poisoning. You see these things at fraternities that are getting cracked down on where they're letting someone drink a large amount of volume of alcohol in a short amount of time, and you can't do that. And you get alcohol poisoning and you don't get attention to pump your stomach, you will die. Risky sexual behaviors, we talked about that. Miscarriages or stillbirth, and that's why in a lot of times drinking alcohol in pregnant women is a risk. And then it talks about long-term, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, cancer. We talk about that. Breast, mouth, throat, esophageal with it. Learning and memory problems, dementia. They're finding a lot of dementia and Alzheimer's can be related to that. Mental health problems, depression, anxiety, social problems, loss of productivity, family problems, unemployment, alcohol dependency or alcoholism. Drugs lead to that as well. So alcohol and drugs feed off of one another. So these problems are for both as when I kind of group those together. So facts about drug abuse, 14% of high school students reporting having used illicit drugs or injection drugs, which you list them right there. 14% of students reported the non-prescription use of opioids, which is becoming a bigger problem. Injection drug use and direct link to HIV and risk of overdose. Youth opioid is directly linked to sexual risk behaviors. Students who ever report using prescription drugs without a doctor's prescription are more likely than other students to have been a victim of physical or sexual dating violence. and drug use associated with sexual behavior, experience of violence, and mental health suicide risks. So again, the younger that kids use these problems, the more likely they're exposed to mental health long-term and also suicide risk. So I can't emphasize that enough. So any state that's going to say, I don't know what the big problem is, right? Let's make some more state revenue. It's just driving me crazy. They want to talk about that. We talked about that again, pretty well the same thing long and term. So that leads us up. The next thing we're going to be getting into, I'm glad I wanted to finish that, is we're going to be talking about the state website on certain diseases and chronic death. Here's a comparison of how they did it. So if you guys want to crunch some numbers over a 5-year period, here's one from New York. I did it for Pennsylvania from 2013 to 2017. I have some graphs. We'll talk about that next time. But if you want to go on the website here, it talks about if you basically go to the state agency website, which is www.healthpa.gov. And if you just look up that, healthpa.gov, it's going to give you every disease studied in each state, leading diseases and also causes of death. It's going to you can actually click and put on that. All the graphs that I formed, Eli helped me form that computer. It just came from that website. I just plugged them in there and did graphs. So I'll go over some of those next time. But in advance, if you guys want to look at that, that's a real good way of looking over the way that occurs. And I did the years 2013 to 17 in Pennsylvania. So if you guys want to go on there and play around with your parents' permission, it's a neat way to look at all the diseases that occur. And when you look at CDCs from the coronavirus, go in and look at all these diseases, the amount of people that are dying from some of these things, and go in and look at how many people from Lyme disease, how that's increased over the last 5 years. It's an amazing statistic. So I'll go over that next time. And I'm going to sign over to you, Sam. We'll close up. Thank you very much. So we're going to be moving ahead from 7 on through, and also health professions. And I'll hopefully wrap up with some of the contagions that we dealt with over the years, and then even the corona and everything I found out lately. And we'll try to finish up next meeting. It's all yours, Sam. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Christian. So everyone do scout. Wait, Tim has a. I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I was fighting Christian with over mouse control. All right. Just kind of a couple quick things and all that for you guys. As far as scout meetings going forward right now, we will continue on the way we have been right now with doing the virtuals until the governor lifts the restrictions, and also once Lake Meade lifts the restrictions on the use of the facilities, we'll be continuing in this mode. So there is no known date at this point. So I know that's been some questions out there. So we'll keep going on this way. The goal right now is we do have a couple things lined up. As Christian said, we're hoping by next week to wrap up most of the stuff for public health. We did have some scouts that was requesting doing family life merit badge. So we'll take a look at that. I think quite a few needs that now. I'll give you a little warning or a heads up on the stuff and all that. If you guys want to pull down some of the worksheets and start looking at some of that, that will be one merit badge where you'll have a fair bit of work that you will have to be doing at home. That's not entirely during meeting time. So if you want to get a jump on that, you can go ahead and take a look at the worksheets for that one. Also, for those participating in CBASE, if you've not seen, we did get some good news that it looks like both of our trips are looking to be on track. So unless something changes in the meantime for us, that seems to be good news at this point. So we still got a few more trainings and other details to kind of work through on that, but it's good news that that's moving forward, at least at this point. Any other leaders have any other updates or any other we'll go to the group here? All right. Sam, it's all yours.
How many,
All right, thank you.
real quick, how many slept out on Saturday night?
Me, I did.
When did it start raining?
About 3 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
It was really hard rain. Fun wind.
That's good. I'm glad you guys did it. So a lot of the parents or you guys had sent me the pics and the information. Some of you even cooked outside. So I was really happy to see that. So I'll produce the names. I got it through. I want to make sure that everybody got credit for doing it. I just wanted everybody to just email me or text me to make sure it was done. So I was joking around what was the meals, but the main thing is I wanted you guys sleeping out overnight. So the cooking was even a bonus. So I saw some good meals. So that was great. So, and I don't think any parents got food poisoning, so that's even better. So, well done.
Dylan showing the evidence. All right, Sam.
All right. Scout sign. Scout law. Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Would everyone please bow their heads for the Lord's Prayer? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
All right. Well, great Scoutmaster of all scouts, be with you until we meet again.
Be prepared.
Be prepared.
All right. Have a good evening, guys.
You too.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.